Isn't tenderize a marvelous word meaning to make meat more tender by beating it or cooking it in a slow cooker? Hello, I'm Lawrence and I'm on a quest to uncover all of the memos that Britain and America lost in the pond, and one of those memos pertains to verbs, doing words. Now, the kind of verbs that are probably on your mind right now are verbs like postpone or quarantine or drink. But there's another one on mine, and that is the word laugh, and that is exactly what I intend to do, even though I'm essentially going to be talking about verbs, and this is the end times. Now, a few videos ago, you may remember me hinting at such a list when I talked about words like customize and choreograph as having been coined in the United States. But what about other action words that were coined in the United States? Which other verbs did it give to the English language? And that is what we're going to talk about today. And so without further ado, here are 7 verbs that the United States, action-oriented that it is, gave to the English language, starting with this. If I'd have thought this one through, I would have come up with some kind of joke or pun about how I'm going to preempt the rest of the list by having this one first, but it doesn't really mean that. Preempt, of course, meaning to take action in order to prevent some kind of event from breaking loose. You know, like quarantining everyone in the world before the virus even shows its ugly face. Well, the word is first attested in American English from 1830 as a back formation of the word preemption, which is kind of ironic in a way if you think about it, because it's almost like they invented the word preempt in order to preempt questions about why there isn't such a word as preempt and only preemption. I'm probably making up a load of rubbish there, but here it is in the Congressional Series of United States Public Documents in 1859. This is one of the earliest usages of it that I could find. Apparently, according to Etymonline, there are earlier instances, and it was in relatively wide use in the US from the late 1800s. Now, it took a bit longer to take off in British English. In fact, it took 2 world wars. I'm going high-pitched because of bombs. So it was once quite rare in British English, but it's not the only word on this list that made it into a congressional document. Roughly 100 years later, the same was true of our next entry. Now, the word regulate had been around for a while, and what's the opposite of regulate? It's not unregulate. It's deregulate, That's right, and it's first attested from about 1950. That's according to Etymonline. And of course it simply means to remove regulatory restrictions from. Try saying that with a mouthful of nuts. And unlike today, when you often hear it used in relation to banks, back then it was mostly used in terms of the railroads and sometimes electric utilities. Interesting, and here it is in a 1956 CQ Congressional Quarterly Weekly report. Again, try saying that with a mouthful of squirrels. The word was most undoubtedly a product of the 1950s, but it saw its largest spike in the 1980s. And that was most likely due to deregulation being a core tenet of Reaganomics under Ronald Reagan. And we didn't really have Reaganomics in Britain because Margaret Thatcher wasn't Ronald Reagan. And so the word didn't really take off in British English until the early 2000s and was presumably still kicking around in 2008 at the height of the recession. I didn't pay any attention. I was moving. What I do know is I absolutely love it when there's a clear indication as to why a certain word was big at one time or another, because the same is true of our next entry. Isn't tenderize a marvelous word meaning to make meat more tender by beating it or cooking it in a slow cooker? But I would be remiss if I didn't point out that before the 20th century, tenderize actually had another meaning just pertaining to, sort of people's emotions, a word that we'll get onto later. Meanwhile, Etymonline insists that the food sense is first attested from 1935. So imagine how this 1914 University of Idaho publication feels not getting the credit it deserves. There's no justice in the world. Either way, the American coin definition is most certainly a 20th century thing, with cases in both countries dramatically on the rise from the early 1970s. And by no great coincidence, that's also when the slow cooker brand Crock-Pot was introduced. Thanks. See, it's amazing when you can pinpoint causes. At least you can't say I'm not enthusiastic. Which brings us on to our next entry. Enthuse, enthuse, enthuse. I'm going to stop talking like a Shakespearean actor, specifically because this word is not as old as Shakespeare, but then nor is American English. It dates back to the late 19th century, and here it is in a Dictionary of Americanisms, a glossary of words and phrases usually regarded as peculiar to the United States. Long titles. And sure enough, it fell into usage in the 19th century as a back formation of enthusiasm, and that makes sense. It does mean to show enthusiasm, but I just wanted to point out that enthusiasm came first and enthuse was hot on the trails. Probably literally in those days. And by all indications, the word enthuse was used at the time quite ironically. Kind of like today when people think they're being funny when they say, adulting is so hard. But for those of us who cringe at that phrase, enthuse ought to give us hope. Its trend history shows that usages peaked in around 1920 before a steady decline in the 20th century. At least that's in American English. In Britain, it's gone from strength to strength, indicating that Brits were more enthused with the word than the Americans who coined it. And so now that you know that information, bottle it up internally in your brain and break it out at parties. Which you won't be surprised to hear is a perfect segue into our next entry. Ah yes, internalize, to make attitudes or behavior part of one's nature by learning or unconscious assimilation. I read that on Google. Etym Online says that this word is first attested from 1856, but I couldn't find much evidence of that in Google Ngrams. I just use Google a lot. In fact, I couldn't find much evidence of it from before World War II, when it started popping up in publications like Totalitarian Communications as a Means of Control. Internalize that, George Orwell. Indeed, usage trends in both countries bear out a post-war upbringing, and yes, verbs are like children in that they're always doing something. And they're always displaying their emotions. Children, not verbs. Which brings us on to our next entry. Yes, the word emote, and as a former actor, I know all about that because, traditionally it is used in the theatrical sense. To portray emotion. Again, I was born in 1590. But this word is clearly not. It's from the 20th century as a back formation of the word emotion. And though instances of this spelling do appear prior to the 20th century, they mostly seem to take the form of a person's name. So just ignore all of those before 1900. For instance, one of the earliest sources I could find to include the word was Guy Gilpatrick's Flying Stories from 1946. And unlike the word enthuse, this one is a reminder that the word adulting could yet go all the way after all. By then, though, perhaps we'll all be geriatricing. That's it for this episode, and looking back on all of the words in this list, there's really only one way to summarize everything we've seen, and that's by ignoring the first 5 words in this very sentence, because we're not done yet. Here's our final entry. I tricked them. You see what I did there? Summarize this, never mind. Summarize, of course, meaning to give a brief statement of the main points. For example, this video asserted that adulting may or may not one day become heartbreakingly unironic. Now, the word appears to be first attested from the 1800s, with the first usage that I could find in the Systematic Bible Teacher from 1875. Sounds riveting. And the word, which is more popular in both countries than, say, in summary, actually hit its peak rather recently, as you can see from this chart. That really is it for this episode now, and let me know in the comments below your favourite verb. I've genuinely never asked anybody that before. Hopefully I'll be happily surprised by the answers. If you've not had a chance to do so, please subscribe to my channel so that my videos don't get lost in the pond. And a significant reminder, if you like what you see on this channel and you just want to get more British American observational information from me, Lawrence Brown, then follow me on Twitter at LostInThePondUS. As ever, a big shout out to all of my patrons, all 113 of them. If you would like to become a patron of Lost in the Pond and support everything we do here, from the lighting to the technology to the research, you can do so at patreon.com/lostinthepond. Among the many perks of doing so is you'll get access to our secret live stream as well as my secret podcast if you pledge $5 or more a month. Okay, that's it. Until next time, cheerio, and I'll see you soon. Thank you for watching this episode of Lost in the Pond. Don't forget to hit my stupid little face to subscribe, and please share this video with the world. Hit me up on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook, and if you would like to support this channel, please do so at patreon.com/lostinthepond.